Some say it inspired the Millennium Falcon. Others say that on a sunny day you can see one glistening from 20 miles away. And others say that it has more firepower than an army of squirrels armed with slingshots and acorns. All I know is, it's the Superfortress. Hey, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and we are back at the New England Air Museum visiting our friends here to check out the B-29 Superfortress, which is, of course, an enormous machine, as you can certainly appreciate, given my size next to it. I'm about the size of the nose wheel there. Let's talk about the B-29 before jumping inside. It's a beautifully restored aircraft, and big thank you here, of course, to the museum for giving us this access and all the patrons and channel members for making Inside the Cockpit 100% community funded. Now, in the B-29 nose section, we have 6 crew positions. We have the bombardier, we have the pilot, we have the co-pilot, we have the radio operator, we have the flight engineer, and we have the navigator. Now, that whole compartment is pressurized, and there is a pressurized, get this, tunnel running along the aircraft all the way to the back, to the aft compartment where we have the gunner section and also the relief crew, and then, of course, the tail gunner as well. Although the tail gunner is, in fact, compartmentalized off from the rest of the aircraft. So there's no way to actually get to that position when you're in flight, which makes it a very solitary experience. Now, this aircraft up front is, before we jump inside and show you all the detail, a couple of notes about it. It is protected, of course, with an armored bulkhead all the way in the back to protect the whole crew, but the pilot and the co-pilot also have a separate armored plate to protect them as well. Talking quickly about the nose wheel here, there is no nose wheel steering. It is done via differential braking on the B-29. However, the nose wheel does feature a self-centering device once you go above 15 degrees to either side. It retracts rearwards into the fuselage, and then up top on the aircraft we also find a couple of antennas. We have antennas for directional finding, we have lateral guidance for landing, that's the RC-103, and we also have trailing antennas that can be spooled out from there. Moving further back, we already see the first turret here in the defensive armament equipment that the aircraft carries. I will talk about that in just a second, however, as we're going around the tail. So let's focus for now more on the front section and also, of course, of the aircraft itself with the engines. What we have here is, first of all, a 4-bladed Hamilton standard constant speed propeller, and that is being powered by the R3350-53. These engines, each individual engine produces 2,200 horsepower if you're running it up at a setting of 2,600 RPMs with 47 inches of manifold pressure. Now that is really your max sort of power setting that you have in the plane, and it's very limited in terms of 5 minutes basically for takeoff or when you really need a boost of power. So what you do instead for cruise, 2,100 RPM and 31 inches on your manifold pressure. We have the air intake here as well. There's a two-burst supercharger featuring in the aircraft as well. One of the panels on the side here is actually, we can have a quick look at that directly here. You can see the two-burst supercharger right here because the museum has demounted the panels, and yeah, beautiful arrangement there. And if we step back, let's talk a little bit more about the engine arrangement, because there's a cool feature inside the B-29. You might remember this also when we did the tour of B-17, the Sentimental Journey. When the control link between the throttles in the cockpit and the engines gets severed, the assumption is that something has horribly gone wrong. Yeah, you are under enemy fire by either fighters or by flak. So what are you going to do? Well, the engine automatically goes onto a full throttle, full open setting to get every bit of power out of it as it can. The engine itself, the arrangement that we have is also featuring a nacelle where the gear retracts inwards and the gear retracts electronically. And this is actually a really cool feature in the B-29. Nearly everything is done electronically. The cowl flaps here, done electronically with manual control by the flight engineer inside the front compartment. and he's trying to keep the cylinder heads there at roughly below 248 degrees Celsius. And there's automatic electrical regulation of the oil temperature as well with the outlet flap, and that keeps the oil at a maximum of 95 degrees. And the only thing that you have that is hydraulic on this aircraft is the differential braking on the main gear. Now you're going to say, like, if everything is electronic, yeah, from the retraction of the gears to, you know, things like cowl flaps to the, of course, the turrets as well as the flaps, where does all this power come from? Well, we have an inboard generator on each inboard engine, that's one, and 2 outboard generators on the outboard engines, 6 generators in total producing that power in order to, well, work all the systems that are installed in the aircraft. Right. We've got an oil tank in the nacelle, 85 gallons. So let's talk about the fuel tanks then. We have an inboard tank, or rather 4 cells that provide a total of 1,400 pounds of fuel for the inboard engine. And then we have the fuel tanks for the outboard engines, 7 cells there, again giving a total volume of about 1,400 pounds. Of course, there's cross-feed and interconnection there, and there's additional fuel tanks that can also be mounted inside or filled inside of the bomb bay, 640 gallons there. Just do the conversion to pounds if you want to. And all the fuel tanks here are also self-sealing. Now, moving then towards the outer section of the wing along the trailing edge, we'll have to watch out for this Hellcat here, which we're also going to be filming here at the New England Air Museum. By the way, just as a quick reminder here, visit museums because they're really kept alive by the patronage of visitors just like yourself in your area. We've got a massive aileron here running all the way to the wingtip, where you also have the lighting requirements that you would expect for navigational lighting. And then we have a very, very large trim tab here as well. We also have the retractable landing light. Moving now towards the flaps, we have a very large piece of flap here, once again electrical deflection, and some of you might now be wondering, hang on, if everything is done electric, how is the backup power generated in terms of emergency? Because when you have hydraulic systems, right, you always just install a hand pump somewhere inside the cockpit, and you can always get somebody just to pump that hydraulic power into, or that pressure into the system in order to make sure that something works. Well, the crew does carry a portable electric motor that can generate enough power in order to do certain elements on the aircraft in terms of emergency, for example, like flap deflection and retraction, which is really rather cool. Moving then towards the fuselage section of the aircraft, which completely dwarfs me here. Maybe we'll have a better look towards the nose here. Josh, if you just step to the right. There is a dinghy that is installed on top of the aircraft there for, you know, in the Pacific, if this aircraft does have to ditch, the crews pop their hatches on top and then get out on top of the aircraft, prepare the dinghy, and then hope for search and rescue to pick them up, of course, because the aircraft is not designed to stay on water for all that long. Weight of the aircraft, 71,000 pounds empty, and it goes all the way up to 120,000 pounds fully loaded. That's your max takeoff weight. However, your sort of combat weight loaded up with bombs is typically about 100,000 pounds. Loadout options, we're going to discuss that once we have a look at the bomb bay. And to move between the positions, for example, if you have to go through the tunnel, you also have portable oxygen cylinders there as well. The aircraft itself is, well, semi-monocoque. It's an American aircraft. That's just how they built them at the time, of course. And then working towards the tail here, we can already see the gunner arrangement to my left now here. Then there's a relief crew compartment where you either have, where you also actually have the radio operator or a radio operator that could do his work in there. And then, of course, you have the tail section with the gunner that we're going to have a look at in just a second. But before we do that, there are 12 oxygen bottles installed inside the aircraft, 7 for the front area and 5 for the rear. And well, you might now be wondering, why are there 7 bottles up there if there's only 6 crew positions? Well, the pilot gets a backup. Now, let's go towards the tail. We do have a tail skid here as well that can be retracted and extended. And actually, this is interesting now. Now that I look at it, this does look like a hydraulical system. So I'm going to have to check whether that is powered by an electric motor or if it's an hydraulic system. That's actually an interesting question that now pops up. Interesting. Sometimes manuals are a bit weird with the way they give information. So it's always good to check out the machines themselves as well in real life. We have the horizontal stabilizer, big trim tab there on the elevator, and of course that's massive rudder there with a trim tab as well. And then let's talk about this turret right here, 250s. All the turrets in the aircraft here have 250s. That's of course 12.7 by 99 millimeter of turret, and the tail gunner has a lot of ammunition, 1,000 rounds per gun, which is required really because there's no real reload, and you would assume that the majority of attacks would come from the rear with fighter interceptors trying to engage a B-29 there. Although, as a recent video that I've actually brought out shows, yeah, there is actually the Japanese adapted to the B-29s relatively well after some teething problems, and generally went for frontal approaches there because they felt that the defensive firepower there would be weaker. There are also turrets in the B-29 that feature a 20 millimeter cannon, additionally to the 250s, and that would be equipped with 125 rounds, but not on this one right here. Now let's loop around, and we'll step over the barrier here with the permission of the museum, or under it, might as well. I'm gonna hold that for you, there you go. In the back here also we have small flaps that open in order to unveil a camera that would be used for BDAs or bomb damage assessment after your attacks, or just simple reconnaissance as well. We'll talk a little bit about the gunner arrangement as well. First of all, what's really cool here at the museum is you have a lot of cool tidbits stashed around. So we have, for example, here the turret, the tail turret, defensive bullet-resistant glass here that would be protecting the gunner there, and yeah, it's a thick sheet of glass. And then we also have the waist gunner, turret computing arrangement, you may say, that they would be using in order to, well, target an enemy fighter and then shoot at it. This whole thing actually works, and the museum has restored it. Now let's move towards the actual gunner compartment. In the B-29, we have 3 crew positions here, one on either side, and then there's a master gunner position who sits in the middle and also has a top view or viewing port. And if you just go over there, Josh, real quick, the master gunner is the one that essentially slews control of different turrets to different people in the aircraft. So for example, the bombardier can take control of the lower turret that's up front. The top gunner, the master gunner, could take control of both turrets, both top turrets at the same time and fire with those at the same target. And then the side gunners here could also take individual control of various turrets. For example, the lower turret here. The only turret that cannot be engaged again is the rear turret, although there is actually a section in the manual that says that if the action is open, or the action switches are open on the tail turret, that someone in here can take control of that, which is quite an interesting tidbit. Now, the turrets itself, where do we have the rear turret? Actually, the rear turret is all the way over there. I've just forgotten that. And there's, of course, the top turret that's over there. Both of them, or all of the turrets here, have 360 degrees rotation, have a 90 degrees elevation, so they can have an all-round view around the aircraft and fire at everything. And each turret is armed with 50 rounds of your 50 cals. Now, let's move towards... Yeah, I think now let's move towards the bomb bay. So we're gonna duck down and I'll meet you on the inside. The light's not on. Okay, keep recording. James! And with the gunners done, let's pop inside the bomb bay, or rather the bomb bays. So follow me. We're gonna duck down into this area right here. And what do we have? Well, we have the aft bomb bay right here. You can see the pressurized tunnel rising. You can see the pressurized tunnel just above me, going between the rear and the front compartment, and you also have those viewing holes on either side to see that there is a good release on its bombs. Now, you can load up a lot of bombs in the B-29 for World War II standards. So you can go all the way up to 20,000 pounds of bombs in total. And in order to get to that level, you do have space for 40 500-pound bombs, which, again, for World War II standards, that's a lot. We might laugh about it today with B-52s running around, but yeah, back in the day, this was the max that you'd see in terms of just raw tonnage. Now, 20,000 pounds of bombs is not going to be your average mission, especially if you set her up, for example, to have a max yield on your bombs. So 4,000 pound bombs here for the B-29, then you're only going to load 4 and you have 16,000 pounds, right? So you're always depending on what target you're engaging, what ranges you have to fly. The more bombs you load, the shorter your ranges and so on. You always have to make sort of a calculation and figure out what is the best yield of what you're trying to do with the target, and what sort of ranges are you flying as well in the terms of what tonnage did you carry. Now, as we then go towards the second bomb bay, we'll have to dock around the bombing radome that is sitting right here, and then just follow me into the 4 bomb bay compartment, and we can already see some bombs mounted here. Those are 500-pound bombs, that the ones I was referring to, and we have an incendiary 100-pound bomb right here as well. We then have the fuel tank, 640 gallons, sitting in the middle for additional range. And then, as you can see right there, that would be usually covered with a sort of porthole, almost like in a ship, with a small little viewing port where you could then look inside of the bomb bay, and you can see that tunnel just above me that I was already referring to. And what's the cool thing about the B-29 as well is these bomb bays can open at any sort of altitude and not depressurize the cabin area nor the tunnel. That's all completely sealed off with the pressurization system and the way that the bomber has been built. With us now done on the outside and practically already inside, all I have to say is one take, and let's have a look inside. Just like a submarine, we enter, and here we are. Got a radio operator's position all the way to my left. Got a navigator right here, followed by the flight engineer. The official entry hatch right here, which would be open, and then there would be a ladder downwards. And then we of course have the pilot, as well as the co-pilot seat right here. And the bombardier up front with a fold out seat right there. Isn't that cool? Now, let's go through all these stations one at a time in full detail. It's going to be awesome. Now let's jump into the B-29 Superfortress. We will go from the rear to the front, starting all the way on the tail with the tail gunner. As the title implies, the tail gunner uses the tail guns. For this, the gunner sits in a small pressurized compartment and is the only one that is truly separated from the crew. Getting to the position is a bit tricky, and it is really the tightest part of an otherwise very comfortable sized aircraft. The guns are used in the same manner as with the other turrets, an explanation of which will be following soon. The first position we have then in the rear compartment is that of the radar operator. This is where the crew's rest area would have been in the early B-29s, but it was then changed with the inclusion of systems like the APQ-13 radar. The radar provides a ground return at night or through clouds, thus the operator can identify the target area and help maintain a level of accuracy during bombing missions in poor visual conditions. The position is equipped as follows. First, we have of course the work desk. Then we have the radar scope, and that is set beside the range unit, followed by the main control unit to the right. In the center, gauges showing from the left speed, heading and altitude. To the right is the radar operator's turn control for the aircraft. This allowed control of the plane's heading when using the radar, similarly to how commands could be given from the bombardier for fine adjustments in course. The typical grey intercom jack box is found beside it, and then there's the oxygen regulator, and an ashtray rounds off this area. Now the intercom, the oxygen regulator and the ashtray, you will find them throughout the aircraft at different stations, and well, I won't point them out again, but you will see them in the background. The main computers for the radar are set beside the table. Then there is the toilet. As you can imagine, long-range bombing or transport missions over the hump with the B-29 take a while to fly, even on a fast bomber like the Superfortress, so this is needed. The top turret and ammo supply are then housed in this large cylindrical roadblock in the middle of the compartment. Notice also the crew equipment dotted around the cabin, from food over to medkits and the emergency equipment. Then we have 3 gunner positions, one on each side of the B-29, plus the master gunner sitting on that central throne, let's call it. They control the turrets, as explained earlier, but this gun sight is quite something. So let's have Jim from the museum's restoration team explain that.
This is the targeting computer and gun sight from a B-29A Superfortress. Let me show you how it works. This is the reticle control knob. This controls the reticle mil dots and can be used to sight in on enemy aircraft. What it does is it changes the mil dot radius, which allows you to track lead, speed, and distance through the mechanical computer. On the left side, there's the safety, which should be held down at all times to allow the gun to fire. You have 2 thumb triggers, here and here. Either one will do the trick. Holding it down will fire both guns. You have full movement in elevation and traverse, and that's how it works.
Then we come to the tunnel, which is set above this little hatch that gives a view into the bomb bay. This provides a seamless pathway from the front to the rear compartment, resulting in 2 separated but interconnected pressurized cabins. I was given the opportunity to crawl through, which I of course took. It was really cool navigating this space, although it doesn't really show that well on camera, so hopefully you don't mind staring at the end of the tunnel for a bit, because I have 3 main observations here. First, the restoration had authentic padding all along the tube. No one ever sees that. This shows how much time, dedication and passion goes into these aircraft at the museum, even though they could have easily called it quits after padding the entrance for the tunnel just for presentation purposes. But they didn't, and I think that speaks highly of them. Second, the tunnel is surprisingly easy to navigate, even for someone above the average height back then. So I imagine going through this with your flight suit and an oxygen bottle is actually quite manageable. And finally, consider the pure engineering marvel that this tunnel represents in the 1940s. Only 3 to 5 years before this aircraft, bar a couple of special exceptions, bombers didn't really have any pressurization. Now we've got 2 compartments connected by a tunnel, all one pressurized entity with cabin altitudes of about 8 to 12,000 feet between 30 to 40,000 feet of altitude. While not equivalent to today's standards, it still compares really well and makes for a much more comfortable ride. And there we go, we got to the front compartment, so let's have an overview first. Going through this with a little bit more detail, starting on the radar operator's position, who was tasked with the operation of the radio equipment, including the directional finding and IFF equipment. Above the work table we see 3 different receivers set beside 2 different transmitters. And directly at the table we find the main radio control unit, as well as the main receiver unit, and above this is the antenna switching unit. And finally a Morse code tapper. On the table you will also see the headphones and microphones. To the left of the table the workstation continues. Here we have the wave meter, used to identify the exact frequency you are on. And below this we find the wave meter's unit's door, which is folded open. On it you find the frequency codes for the radio units that are mounted on this specific machine. Apparently these codes actually varied for each machine, so getting individual charts must have been quite a complex job. Below this you have the transmitter control unit, and then we finish off with 2 signaling lamps to the left, a dyna motor, and a flight suit heater connection point. Again, flight suit heater connections are dotted around the aircraft along all the positions, so I won't point them out again. Then we move to the navigator position, just opposite the radio operator. We notice a few more details here. Two life raft release handles are set around the tunnel as we move to this position. Then there is an hydraulic fluid tank, as well as a storage space and the LORAN radio navigation control unit. The LORAN unit is installed behind the navigator's seat, which is facing forward. The navigator has a work table used mainly for charts. Above the table, a radar scope. The radar could be used for navigation and bombing, hence it was also useful for the navigator. Mounted on the wall, we have the container for navigational charts. Next to it, a radio compass, and finally flight instruments showing speed, altitude and heading. Coming to the flight engineer, we suddenly find a whole lot of dials and switches. The flight engineer assists the pilots with engine management and sits facing backwards. The basic instruments are as you'd expect. The needles are often doubled to show the reading for each engine on either side. Let's go top to bottom, left to right. First, the carburetor air and cylinder head temperature. Then the yellow box is for the oil system, showing the oil temperature, and then the oil pressure. The oil and fuel quantity meters feature tank selectors, and then on the central column we have cowl flap position indicators. In the blue box, the RPM and manifold pressure gauges for the engines, and then the red box, you have the fuel pressure. Moving to the white box to the right, those are the basic flight instrument gauges. And then the offset column to the right has the intercooler flap position indicator and airflow meters. On the far left we find the primary emergency controls for engines. These include the fuel cutoffs as well as the fire warning and fire extinguisher switches for each engine. Set to the side of the flight engineer, a few controls for cabin light, pressurization and air conditioning. We also find checklists and helpful diagrams. Moving back to the controls, below the main gauges we have a lot of levers and switches. To the left of the flight engineer we have the cowl and intercooler flap controls. And then moving forward, the automation switches for the oil cooler flaps and the engine starter switches. In the central position we find the engine primers and electrical generator and battery switches. To the right, pitot heater and, in the red box, fuel transfer switches. Then some levers on the left of the flight engineer's position. The red handles are for the bomb doors, the white ones are for cabin air, set depending on pressurization, and the right handle is for the vacuum pump. Finally, the flight engineer has some engine controls. These could come in handy, for example for startup or when regulating the engines during flight. The blue handles are the throttles and the red ones are the mixtures. The offset red handle locks the mixture controls to their setting. Now, a more general note about the aircraft. I've been inside a few World War II bombers by now. The B-29 is by far the most comfortable one in my book. Of course, it offers more space due to its size, so let's not go apples and oranges here. However, given that the B-29 was meant for long-range missions, it is no surprise that it was to be comfortable for the crew. There is plenty of space throughout the cabin, and even as I am hunched over, I never really felt like I was in danger of knocking into things, which is very different to some other bombers. Also, the seats are really comfortable. After sitting on that flight engineer's seat, I just dozed off for a few minutes. Maybe it was the jet lag, but I really enjoyed that seat. Then coming to the pilot's position. This is the seat that has far less going on than one might suspect given the size of the aircraft. Forward and side visibility from it between the pilot and co-pilot is great. However, the yoke does obstruct some of the instruments. Let's have a closer look. In front of the pilot, mounted for better visibility, we have from left to right the airspeed indicator, a bank and turn indicator, and the vertical speed indicator. And then on the lower left we have the altimeter, a turn indicator compass, a gyroscopic artificial horizon, and finally a blind landing indicator. These latter three gauges are very difficult to see from the pilot's perspective without moving your body. Shifting to the right of the central instrument gauges, from left to right, top to bottom, the pilot direction indicator, followed by two manifold pressure gauges with dual indicators, the bearing and directional compass, two RPM gauges, and a radio compass on the bottom. Next to the radio compass you have warning lights if the turret is not positioned correctly for landing. Then the IFF switch and detonators. This prominent placement is a common sight in US planes of the time, meant to be used to destroy the IFF system to prevent it falling into enemy hands. You may have seen it in a previous Inside the Cockpit video. And while I'm at it, make sure to, of course, check out the playlist that feature a growing selection of aircraft. To the side of the pilot's seat, this time filmed on the co-pilot side for better access, we have the rudder and aileron trim. The elevator trim wheel is further forward towards the dash, with the side-mounted throttles for either pilot. The co-pilot seat has a more minimal setup to the pilot. Away are the engine dials, but included are the flap position, RPM limit, and landing gear indicators. Set between the seats an emergency hydraulic pump, and talking about the seats, they can be adjusted with this yellow handle right here. Finally, the pilot controls the aircraft via the rudder pedals and this control yoke. A push-to-talk microphone button is included on the yoke, as well as a quick select autopilot switch. Then the final position, the bombardier. Set in the front seat, the bombardier uses a centrally mounted Norden bomb sight to put the bomb on target. To the left, we find the primary instruments for bomb release. This includes instrument gauges, for example speed and altitude, as well as selectors for the release. A salvo control unit is set below this centrally, and bomb door controls are mounted to the left, while the bombardier gets visual feedback on bomb load and release from the bomb bay indicators. Set above these weapons controls, we find a control unit for the downward-facing recon and BDA camera. Moving to the right, we have the main control unit for the turret. A radar altimeter is mounted below this. To use the chin turret, the bombardier swings over the turret control unit. It functions identically to the previous turrets we discussed. Finally, an easy-to-spot detail here, the push-to-talk button, or rather step-to-talk button. This is used with your foot and opens up the intercom to talk with your fellow crewmen. Various positions in the B-29 had this control, but it was the easiest here to film. And that's the B-29. And that brings us to an end here with the B-29 Superfortress. Big thank you to the New England Air Museum for this fantastic access they have given us and supporting the filming here to bring all of this in full detail to you. So please also put your appreciation to the museum in the comments below. And if you live in the area or if you're passing through, do check out the museum because visitors like yourself keep these places alive. Big thank you also to the community, the patrons, the channel members for making Inside the Cockpit 100% community funded. And as always, I wish all of you a great day and see you in the sky. And I'm just gonna chill in here for a little bit longer because it's just so damn cool. Yes.